Okay, the next part we're going to go through is identification of risk. So, the risk identification part of the process allows us to identify the risks that we need to manage. Those that we don't identify, obviously, are those risks that we don't manage. The comprehensive identification, therefore, is really important using a well-structured, systematic process. And identification needs to include the risks, whether or not they are within the control of the organisation. Now, as we alluded to in session 1, it's about events. It's not about causes, it's not about consequences, it's about events. And if you cannot conduct a post-event analysis on a particular event or a particular risk, that you have in your risk register, then there's no way that it should be in your risk register. We are dealing with events. Through post-event analysis, this assists us in understanding whether the risk that we have in our risk register is appropriate. So it's focused on identifying what can happen, where and when, how it can happen, what will the consequences be if the risk does occur, what controls do we currently have in place and how effective are they? And I must tell you right now that we're going to talk about controls, and I'll give you the pre-soapbox warning for that. We need to also understand and remember it's about risks and not issues. These are things where there's a chance that it might happen, but there's also a chance that it might not happen. An issue, as we talked about in session 1, is something that has already occurred. The incident has already taken place. So, the first thing that I want to talk about is risk sources. Now, if we are in a large organisation and we say, what are the risks to that organisation? If we try and do that in one hit, it's like trying to eat an elephant. What we want to try and do is break it down so that we can identify or have these smaller bite-sized chunks that we can identify risk against. Now, risk sources are defined in the ISO 31 as the element which alone or in combination has the intrinsic potential to give rise to a risk. The 4360 standard, which has obviously been superseded, highlighted that identifying sources of risk and areas of impact provides a framework for risk identification and analysis, focuses risk identification activities, and contributes to more effective management of risk. So how do we do that? How do we identify those sources of risk? We do this through the risk breakdown structure. So within complex organisations, the identification of risk, as I said, becomes problematic unless we have a well-developed risk breakdown structure which breaks it down into those bite-sized chunks I referred to. It provides a means for the organisation to structure the risks being addressed or tracked. And it can be considered as a hierarchically organised depiction of the identified risks arranged by activity or source of risk. It also has the ability to allow us to look at the cumulative effect of risk across the organisation. And more importantly, it allows us to identify the total risk exposure to the organisation. Now, what does it look like? Well, you'll find it very, very difficult to see that in your notes. However, I have included a larger copy of this in the templates. So that's what it might look like for an organisational breakdown. This is one that we might see for a project. And in session 3, when I go through the project risk management, there is a copy of that also in the templates, and we'll go through that in session 3. But as you can see, we've got this hierarchical structure. So in this case, we're able to break it down into those constituent elements within the organisation, and then we ask the fundamental question against each of those boxes: what can go wrong or what has gone wrong in the past in terms of events? What can go wrong and what has gone wrong in the past? And if you ask those questions as opposed to what are the risks, you will find that people will be very, very forthcoming in terms of identifying those events that either have happened or potentially could happen.